You mentioned briefly of how you see blockchain communities. What are blockchain communities? How are they going to, a limited extent, privatize the nation state?
I think a lot of people think of a blockchain as an append-only database that is distributed, right? And usually used as a ledger, for recording transactions that represent financial applications. At the core of it, in my view, is that you can basically reframe or recast what a public blockchain is doing as a form of a parliamentary sovereignty, right? It is basically this sort of automated parliamentary system that is establishing an order. Then what you do with that can be completely up for grabs.
How do you see the world different in let's say 10, 20, and 50 years versus somebody who doesn't think that blockchain communities are going to do anything?
Well, I think one of the arguments that I get is around what community is going to be different, right? And because they typically think of say communities that are based on ethnicity or genetics. And my argument on that front is those are going to persist. Those are very strong cultural symbols that are literally embedded in the fabric of our being. In addition to that, there are a lot of new sets of social group. In the early days of the internet, it was kind of viewed that these communities would be able to find each other, people who had similar interests would be able to find each other. I view it as more like a formalization of their capacity to be able to organize at scale. You could imagine that these different identity groups then have their own state, right, or own order, and their own sets of rules and procedures in which they can achieve their collective goals. This sort of lack of territorial requirements by design enables that, because these people are disparate across the globe.
Hello, and welcome to the Charter Cities podcast. I'm Mark Letter, and I'm joined today by Jarrad Hope. Jarrad, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So you've recently written a provocative book, and I guess I'd like to start. What was the kind of peak nation state? Or when was nation state, let's say, not what, when?
So the peak nation state, I guess it kind of depends what you mean. There's kind of two periods. I think there's the classical sort of Westphalian peak, which is around the sort of mid-1800s to the early sort of 1900s, and that's kind of where most continental empires had finished unifying into these linguistically defined nation states. And then I guess there's probably another period, from the mid-1940s to the sort of late 70s, where you had this sort of decolonization period, and you had the UN Charter universalized, and the UN membership swelled, from 51 states to 144 states. So I think there's Jarrad Hope, I forget his last name, but he had this quote saying that it was the triumph of the nation state during this period.
I would tend to agree with your first, right? Peak nation state, in my mind, arguably peaked during World War I. World War II, because kind of my framework is, right, the nation state is basically, it's a coordination tool. And the Westphalian, or maybe not peak nation, but also when this, I don't know, the Westphalian order maximized, or however you want to define it. Because kind of, I don't know, function of the Westphalian order was to say, basically, there is a number of approximately equal powers. They don't have to be fully equal, but equal enough that if one kind of quote unquote aggresses against another, then the kind of party that's being aggressed on can fight back enough that it causes enough damage that it makes sense to reach a truce, and to say all right, we're going to have defined rules for what you can do inside, and then defined rules for interacting with each other outside. And part of that was also, to a certain extent, right, enforced by the United Kingdom, because their raison d'etre has always been, we can't let there be a single united power in Europe, because if there is a single united power, right, our independence will be threatened. And so, in at least my, I don't know, right, framing is then, therefore, after World War II, right, even though there was decolonization, in some ways it wasn't right, it was real to an extent, but it also wasn't real to an extent, right? Most of these countries that were being decolonized had no meaningful force projection capabilities. They were nation states, but only guaranteed under the international order. That was kind of a function of American and Soviet guarantees. And so it wasn't go for it.
No, I was going to say there's bipolarity that you had at the time between these two powers. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in the kind of 19th century, at least, the European nation states all had, right, internal coherence and force projection capabilities, that they weren't being propped up. Like some of them were, like Belgium, for example, did exist to a certain extent with the United Kingdom as a guarantor, but it wasn't, right. Like it was able to police internally, it was able to establish its own rules much better than a lot of the kind of recently countries that were decolonized in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the difference between like a de jure sovereignty and a de facto sovereignty, right? Like you're able to actually maintain your own economy and your own borders yourself and not reliant on like a set of institutions that came into manifestation and are more global in their nature.
So then if, right, we've already passed peak nation state, what comes next?
What comes next? You mean in terms of like the international legal order or
Well, what is, I guess, interpret the question how you will. Like, part of it is international legal order, and part of it is also like, just right, like how do people then define themselves and interact with each other? And the nation state's like a
yeah,
large
okay.
bundle of services.
Sure. So I guess like following on what you said, like you reminded me of this book. I don't know if you've read it called Is the International Legal Order Unraveling?
I don't remember that one.
You should check it out. I think you'd like it. It was done by a bunch of lawyers from the American branch of the International Law Association. It's a collection of essays edited by Sloss, I think. But they kind of partition up, you know, like these different phases of like world order in a similar way to you, right? So like up until 1945, you had this more sort of like Westphalian baseline of sovereignty-centered states. Then through like, you know, the Cold War, you had this sort of construction of like this rules-based order. And, you know, this when you get the UN Charter, Bretton Woods institutions, and so on. And that kind of, in their view, I think went till the 90s, in which then like after the, you know, the collapse of the Soviet Union and a bit more stability there, you had this sort of unipolar liberal world, which is, you know, basically US as the guarantor of safety and more proliferation of like globalization trends. But then like I would say that I think it's like around 2010, they view it as a sort of multipolar backlash as China starts to uprise, you know, and so on. There's a bunch of different backsliding away from these sort of agreements that were made under the rules-based order from a bunch of different states. And I guess that kind of brings us into the present day, where there is a lot more uncertainty on the world stage. There are a lot more non-state actors participating on the world stage. And so like this state-centric system is still there, and like it's not like it's just weakened, right? Like it's not like it's ever collapsed or fallen apart. It is kind of morphed into different forms. But there's definitely a lot more uncertainty now. I think like, you know, in terms of Farewell to Westphalia and like, you know, these projects or like the ideas that like I push forward, I don't really see the nation state like disappearing at all. You know, I think that it's probably more like a form of privatization where certain services that are kind of burdening the states at this point can probably be moved into these systems to, you know, to offer services in a hopefully better, potentially more auditable, more impartial manner. But we can get into that a little bit later, I guess. And then like I can imagine nation states continuing to persist, not only because of their cultural, like the nation building they've done and like the cultural symbols they've created, so the extended kinship ties are there, but also for the security that they provide on certain borders. And I don't think that's a very, you don't want that to go away, right? Like, because then you get a lot of instability in the world.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at the history of the nation state. The nation state kind of emerged to a certain extent as a reaction to what might be called like pre-nation state privatization, where the feudal order was kind of not what we would think today of as private property, but right, like a lot more aligned with our ideas of private property than modern nation states. Or at least with modern nation states, right, there's a sense that the state represents some idea of the public, the common good. And before then, right, if there was a kingdom, then the kingdom had literal property rights in a lot of areas of governance, where he might farm out, right, like taxation rights to other actors, cutting them a percentage of the revenue share, then allowing them to have some of those taxation rights. And right, like part of the question is, right, like why did the nation state emerge? My preferred understanding is it's kind of a combination of Enlightenment ideals combined with kind of much higher rates of literacy, a la printing press, combined with merchants and then later industrialization, right? If you look at proto nation states, for example, the Netherlands and then the United Kingdom, right? Like it was largely merchants taking control from the landed aristocracy and then basically trying to institute a set of rules that would benefit trade a little bit more and lead to kind of right like better outcomes for themselves, while the landed aristocracy was primarily concerned with not trade and innovation but just extracting rents.
Okay, interesting. It's pretty in-depth kind of viewpoint. I guess I'm kind of curious, like, I mean, I'm sure you're probably familiar with the concept of like neo-medievalism, right? So I wonder, like, there's this idea that at least, Hedley Bull is a proponent of this idea and believes that we are kind of moving into this sort of like new sort of medieval era in which there are different like overlapping authorities, which is very clearly the case now. I guess like I viewed that sort of that period as an issue of overlapping authorities and a lack of clarity on like, which jurisdiction is where. And then today, like, we have like large amounts of industrialization, large amounts of literacy, depending on where you are on the planet, of course. Like, how do you reconcile like those contributing factors to like this sort of disillusion or like the rise of transnational policy networks that are undermining the sovereignty of nations today then?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one question when nation states emerged was what is the right kind of unit for a nation state, right? So if you look at France, for example, I think like in 1850, only like 20 or 30% of the country spoke French as a first language, right? The rest of the country did not speak French. And what happened is France is basically the conquest of the rest of France by Paris, where Paris kind of enforced language, cultural norms on the rest of France that like had some historical relatedness, but were not like kind of French as we think of that today. And so I would, I guess, characterize it as two things. One, you see the kind of rising global elite or whatever you want to call it. And that is to some extent, right, like trying to create a set of norms that global norms that are largely basically American or Western norms to try to, right, like create this new trading networks and the advantages that come from them. I think that's combined with just like the typical, let's call it like organizational or a life cycle where after a certain period of time, right, a lot of friction gets built up in the organizations. There's less asabiya, there's less kind of shared identity. And that leads to people kind of undermining the system on a lot of different small margins, which ends up adding up over time to get to the situation we're in today. But let me, I guess, kind of return to your book. So you do kind of bring up an example that I wasn't familiar with, looking at how I think it was Leibniz created, like advocated for basically using public records for governance, and then analogizing that to blockchains today and how they could be implemented kind of and take over some governance responsibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so like on your point, like this fractionalization is kind of why I think that this technology is useful for being able to provide order to identity groups or any kind of community, depending on how they establish their kinship ties. And then I guess I imagine like a sort of Darwinian process in which how these things evolve beyond that. What that looks like is a little unclear to me at this stage. As for like Leibniz, this guy was, most people probably know him as like the sort of inventor of calculus, right? Like this guy was a polymath, complete genius. But he had this great idea of essentially creating like what we know as like smart contracts today, in some sense. So first he wanted to create like public records for the state, the governing bodies at this time. But then he also wanted to create a machine that would be able to operate over the set of rules and procedures and the cases associated with them, the records that were made, to then make determinations for the prince, He certainly did not have the capacity or means to be able to ever implement this at that point in time, but like this idea itself was kind of just really profound, and it's kind of funny that it's taken up until like you know uh, beyond 2000 to really see that manifest in the way that he probably intended. Uh, the only difference here is that like we're doing this over a distributed ledger or a distributed archive for other reasons that basically that he didn't foresee, and of course he wouldn't be able to.
I mean, you mentioned briefly kind of how you see blockchain communities, right, like evolving, and that like there will be some competitive process. Why don't we get a little bit more in the details of like what are blockchain communities, right? How are they gonna, to a limited extent, like privatize the nation state? Like what aspects of the nation state are going to be unbundled? You mentioned obviously physical security is very important, and you don't expect that to be unbundled, at least not in the short term. So let's kind of dive into like what this thesis means in practice.
Sure. There's a few different angles that I would, or perspectives that or threads that are kind of like required to understand it. But like, I think a lot of people think of like a blockchain as like, an append-only database that is distributed, right? And usually used as a ledger, for recording transactions that represent predominantly today, like, financial applications. There was this paper done by Leslie Lamport called The Part-Time Parliament, where he was describing one of the consensus protocols for distributed systems called Paxos. And to illustrate his point within that paper, he described a fictitious Greek island called the Paxos Island. And the story basically has these merchant ships, traders, that are using this island, as their sort of base of operations, their sort of like pirate utopia, let's so to speak. And they all want to basically do commerce and do trade, and so like, but they also recognize the need for governing institutions on their island to be able to trade amongst each other and pass legislation and so on. The issue being there is that none of them can actually be there as full time, because they all have their own self-interest and want to perform other duties, right? So the Paxons created this consensus protocol in which they were able to pass legislation while not having everyone present, but still be able to maintain the integrity of the order. And so that way you could have like basically an order in which you can establish a government or any legal system on top of, while at the same time being able to have high churn between the participants. And so at the core of it, in my view, is that you can basically reframe or recast what a public blockchain is doing as a form of a parliamentary sovereignty. Right, it is basically the sort of automated parliamentary system that is establishing an order. Then what you do with that is, can be completely up for grabs, right? And this really separates governance into kind of like two paths. In the space, it's kind of called on-chain governance and off-chain governance. But it's like, how I view it, at least within this sort of framing, is that the on-chain governance is more like, your legal systems or legal institutions that you can represent as like sort of procedures or rules and so on. Whereas the governance that's happening off that chain is more like a, Carl Schmittian political theology, where like, he who decides the exception is sovereign, right? And we kind of see this in practice, whether you're, like say, for example, figures behind blockchains, Vitalik is a very popular one, but he has like huge sway over the protocol, depending on like, how he, depending if whether his ideas, which are all usually pretty good, come out, and then the community then chooses to participate in that and make it happen or not. More so that you can also access the source code, right, and contribute to it. So in many ways, it's more participatory than like what the parliamentarians have implemented today. Whether that's a good thing or not, and whether we want a parliamentary system or not, is up to debate. And of course, there's design parameters where you can change all of that. But to like have a deeper appreciation of like why that might be interesting, there was like, you have to kind of consider like this notion of like virtual worlds, right? And there was a paper that came out in I think 2001, talking about virtual worlds and their economies, and it was looking at massively multiplayer online role-playing games such as Ultima Online and World of Warcraft. And in that paper, they showed that some of these online virtual worlds had economies or GDPs larger than some smaller nation states. And to me, that was quite mind-blowing at the time, right? Like that you could have something that was basically entirely virtually represented, yet could have an economy that was comparable with something that was existing in the real world. And as like the sort of digital divide becomes more and more blurred, I think that these systems will start having more and more impact in the real world. And in fact, you can probably look at, most governance or most, governing institutions as virtual systems anyway. Where even like our money is becoming more and more cashless, and, whether that's a good thing or not, but like these systems are becoming more and more digitized. I can go further there, but I think it's a natural stopping point.
Sure. So I guess one question is, one is like, how does this differ from like what might be the normal conception of a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, where like my normal conception of a DAO is basically a group chat with a bank account, right? Where there is a group chat, there's some defining feature that says these people are participating, these people aren't. You can have various gradations on that. And the bank account is kind of the crypto element, where then you can say, look, we'll have, I don't know, like X amount of USDC in an account, and to be able to send money, we need to meet, I don't know, whatever criteria the DAO sets for itself. So is that like analogous to what you're describing? Is that not analogous, right? Like,
So I think like for a DAO, I'm a little bit an old timer when it comes to like the notion of a DAO. In the sort of earlier days, how like a DAO was conceptualized was really more about information asymmetries around sort of gig economy marketplaces, right? Or more abstractly, algorithmically controlled organizations. So for example, something like Uber. Uber has a huge information asymmetry against its contractors, let's say. Contractors have almost no insight into how those systems operate, yet what work is available to them and when is algorithmically determined, and they basically just are told what to do, when to do, and so on. And so that kind of goes to like this sort of notion of like rational control when it comes to organizations. Most organizations are bureaucratic today in their nature, but there was this trend, or is this trend, that they become more and more algorithmic. And so like even things like Amazon becoming more and more algorithmic in terms of how they're actually managed. And so the idea was that, okay, well, how can we create an organization or the organization algorithm in which it is impartial and is auditable to all participants within that. So you could imagine like, and there was implementations of this, such as Swarm City, that did like the sort of algorithmic decentralized autonomous organizations for ride sharing. Then you could, like, if you wanted to start dreaming even further into the future, you could imagine that the actual cars themselves became self-owning, got their own, basically paid for their own repairs and cleaning through the proceeds of their generation by participating in this sort of DAO-like marketplace. I know I leaned a little bit too heavily on the sort of Uber analogy there, but like there's a more general understanding of that, of algorithmic control and organizations that employ these. So that's, was the ideal. But I'd say that, the material manifestation of how that's come out is basically what you said, right? Is a multi-sig with a group chat. I think that that's a pretty apt way of understanding how DAOs are today. In my view, this largely has come out through the experimentations on voting systems. Some which most don't really get employed because other factors come into play as you're actually trying to build one of these things. And I guess maybe how you might want to conceptualize say a DAO versus a network state / blockchain community is that a DAO is operating within this sort of legalistic system, right? It's the multi-sig is part of the order or the on-chain governance side of things, whereas the blockchain community or network state, crypto state, has this parliamentary sovereignty or is actually doing the order itself, and participating. People are participating in consensus, and there is this off-chain component to writing the client code or the constitution in which all participants are participating in the base general policy that is being implemented by the protocol.
Okay, so you kind of, I guess the key difference is let's call it more holistic feature for a blockchain community where it envisions the participants in the community as active members, not just kind of with a multi-sig wallet, but kind of making changes and updating the protocol. I mean, I think there's a lot of
Not all, but yeah, a subset of them. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of, I guess, kind of this description sort of reminds me of some of these debates I used to follow, not as much anymore, with anarcho-syndicalism, where I don't know if you've ever read any of them. They're all just why don't the workers just own all the companies? And the answer is well, they can't, right? There's a lot of co-ops. Some of them are successful and most of them aren't very successful. And workers can also own companies by buying stocks. And the fact is most workers would prefer to buy stocks in Fortune 500 companies than put all of their interest in a single co-op that they help manage, because it helps with risk diversification, and because in a modern economy, having some form of centralized control in a competitive system tends to lead to more efficient outcomes than kind of co-ops. So one, is this analogy fair, the kind of co-op to DAO and or blockchain community analogy? And then two, I guess, yeah, if it is fair, then why would we expect to see a different outcome with blockchain communities than we do with kind of co-ops?
I don't think that it's analogous to a co-op. I think that you could establish a co-op on a blockchain community or have one as that. But it really, for me, the idea that I'm trying to convey here is that the order itself and the society, or around the new sovereign that's created, a new society is formed in which they're participating within that, right? And it's more about the competitive landscape that is created, in which anyone can create any kind of institution or any set of smart contracts in which or any kind of system on top of in which they can coordinate themselves. If they would like to create a co-op on top of that, and it fits their context, then that's great. I don't think that will probably work out. I think it's probably more likely that you'll probably see equivalents of on-chain companies becoming a thing. But I think more generally speaking, it's this order that is a blank slate that is not entirely bound to or erected by law alone, right? And not even by a monopoly on violence alone. It has its other systems of enforcement, but then on top of that, you can do any kind of experimentation. So I kind of view it as a sort of blank slate for or a startup sector for competitive governance.
Okay, so maybe I didn't, I guess, fully understand your book. Let me try to understand this concept a little bit better. I mean, another kind of, I guess, possible analogy is, right, current modern corporate structure did not really exist kind of came into existence about 150 years ago, right? Like when America was founded, for example, like to be a corporation, you need a charter from the state, right? The state needed to grant you an explicit charter to do X. And like there was no process by which I would say, all right, let me just fill out some paperwork and send it in. No, the state legislator would have to vote on a charter. And like over time, right, like that kind of changed to the point there are like multiple corporate forms where you can say like, okay, I want a corporation, which means like the directors have no liability for anything that goes wrong. Why was that valuable? Because that allowed them to attract a lot more capital than would otherwise have been the case, right? I think the railroad construction played a large role in the development of the modern corporation. Um, you also have kind of partnerships and stuff where the director still might have a legal liability, but there are kind of, right, a variety of different like corporate forms and then also like non-corporate forms, right? Obviously, if I'm going to dinner with friends, I don't need a corporation. If I'm hosting a small event, I don't need a corporation. So I guess your claim is, if I understand it correctly, is that like blockchain uh, offers a new, I mean, corporate form might not be like the perfect analogy, but maybe it's like a new evolution or a new step change or a new something that says like, here is a way to organize humans differently, and this will lead to like different outcomes. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I guess like I would probably be even more conservative than that, right? Like I would say that this is just an incremental improvement on parliamentary sovereignty, right? Or a parliamentary system. The difference being, though, is that it's happening over the wires. It's not territorially bound. And it can be used at almost any scale, right? Whether we're talking about like associations or we're talking about the United Nations. I mean, that's kind of like the absolute sort of general version of what I'm trying to say here.
Sure. Well, let me, I guess, okay. So, like, in my mind, then, like, one, just, I don't know if this historical example is relevant, but like, right, parliament emerged largely because basically the kings wanted more taxing authority. They were like, I want to tax everyone more. And the nobles were like, no, can't tax us more. And the king was like, fine, I'll only tax you more if the parliament agrees, who's a representation of the nobles, right? And over time, that kind of got expanded to now like everyone can vote. But like it basically originally merged as a contract between kings and noblemen to allow greater taxation, with kind of parliament functioning as an oversight on the king. I don't know if that's relevant to this point, but transaction costs rule everything around me. And so if I think about, right, like uh, uh, right, if you're trying to govern a large territory, an area, nation state, right, it makes sense to have all these inefficiencies built in the system because you want to tie the hands of the sovereign and you want to make sure you've got stable rules and like things are predictable, right? If you're trying to make decisions on a much kind of, I don't know, like smaller basis, then right, you might not want to do that. If you're doing a startup, right, you might want somebody who's able to make like really fast and efficient decisions. And so I mean, I don't know, maybe I'd go like a little bit further than you in saying, right, like it's at least my understanding of, maybe not blockchain communities, but like what blockchains could potentially be used for is they would be able to structure, right, decision making a lot. Like when I think about parliamentary decision making, I think about like one specific type where like people vote on a set of things that is like defined in some written document or some deep tradition, and then they vote on those, and then something implements those things. Well, at least with kind of blockchains, you can structure the voting rights in like, I don't know, a huge number of different ways, which I don't, maybe kind of corresponds to your definition of blockchain, but offers, I don't know, a slightly, is that similar to how you think about it, or not?
Yeah, I think so. I guess like the generalization goes a little bit further, right? Like so when you're participating in consensus for establishing the order, like it has to be like on a set of rules or policy, a policy that is so general that it basically does almost nothing apart from including transactions, right? And whatever the transactions are is kind of completely arbitrary, and up to, at least in the current implementations, the amount, whether you've paid the fee to be able to include it within the system itself, right? But then when it comes to like almost every other system, that can happen like within the transactions themselves. I think that when I say like comes to let's say that like this notion of kings and like having transaction costs on binding them. I think that like these systems are also kind of interesting from that regard, in the sense that like you still have like the notion of like the crown as a cultural symbol. Nakamoto is kind of like the king made of stone, right? So he embodies like personifies a set of ideals that is actually kind of genius, because people still reference him or what he said, or she, um, as ways of navigating like the political discourse around the Bitcoin protocol. Uh, in the case of Ethereum, it's a little bit different because we have a live king, right? Which is, say, Vitaly Buterin. But he, even though, he is a prominent figure, he's in the Ethereum Foundation. Ethereum Foundation is very involved in the Ethereum protocol. His power is not coupled directly to the order itself, and so it's kind of like a form of soft power, or um, you know, I guess like the trendy word would be to use as like influencer, right? He has a tremendous amount of social capital in which he can proclaim things, and because he's built up this social capital and because he's in this sort of socially authoritative position, people are more likely to listen to him and be swayed, by his opinions, which then, if passes, through enough people and to the right people, can then influence the baseline policy or the client code, that or specifications of the protocol itself. So that's pretty. I find that pretty interesting, right? Because it's and another way you could probably, like, if you wanted to kind of distill that out, is that there are these sort of nobles or lords. They might be like miners or researchers or coders that are contributing to the creation and maintenance of these orders or systems. So I guess that's kind of how I'd map that idea.
How do you see the world different in, like, let's say 10, 20, and 50 years versus somebody who, like, doesn't think that blockchain communities are going to do anything?
Well, I think like one of the arguments that I get, right, is around like what community is going to be different, right? And because they typically think of, like, say, communities that are based on ethnicity or genetics, based on like linguistics, or even like behavioral patterns, right? And like my argument on that front is like those are going to persist, right? Like those are very strong cultural symbols that are literally embedded in the fabric of our being. So they're very, very hard to change or dissuade. Now you can do that over multiple generations if the people let that happen to them, and it certainly has been argued that is the case in some cases. In addition to that, there are a lot of new sets of social groups, so like fractionalization, as I think you're referring to it before, different identity groups who base their extended kinship ties on some ideology or on some way of being, in a similar way that, like, in the early days of the internet, it was kind of like viewed that these communities would be able to find each other, like people who had similar interests would be able to find each other. I view it as more like a formalization of their capacity to be able to organize at scale, right? And so you could imagine that these different identity groups then have their own, like, I don't like to use the term, but like state, right, or own order, and their own sets of rules and procedures in which they can achieve their collective goals, whatever they may be. So this sort of lack of territorial requirement by design enables that, because these people are disparate across the globe.
Sure. So, I mean, I definitely agree that, like, the world has a lot more, or maybe not the world, at least America has a lot more like ideological sorting than it used to. Right. Where if you go back to the 1950s, you just look at like Republican Democrat marriage rates. I think the intermarriage rates were like fairly high. Like now, if you look at like, I think the Democrats are much more disapproving of marrying Republicans than Republicans are of marrying Democrats. But right, like if you look, there's a lot of like you asked like would you be okay like marrying a Republican or your daughter or son marrying a Republican, like that number was like skyrocketed over the last like decade or so. And then in addition to that, you've got some of these like new communities. I mean, Don't Die might be one of the most kind of successful tech oriented one, with Brian Johnson. Obviously you've got like the crypto, Ethereum, Bitcoin, other communities, right? They each have their own kind of flavor. You've got like the Abundance Bros, right? And these, like with the Rationalists, for example, like you have some of these communities starting to like sort in real life too, right? The Rationalists obviously have Berkeley, and then a few other kind of outposts in other areas. I know there's like a community of them in Austin, I think one in Boston, other places. So yeah, I'm pretty sympathetic to the thesis that there is like increased ideological sorting and like fighting your tribe or whatever the kids call it these days. I guess it's not obvious to me why a blockchain would help with these communities, right? The rationalists seem to be organizing quite effectively without a blockchain. Like, if the rationalists were to adopt a blockchain, like, what would that give them that they don't already have?
I would say that's because they're probably not doing anything that upsets the regimes in which they're operating in. Um, I think maybe another way to view this is like, let's take on, that there's global challenges that we have, climate change, fertility, even health. There have been multiple attempts to basically get various nations to agree to achieve some outcomes around some of these issues, right, on the world stage. I think that, in 50 years' time, like I imagine like the United Nations or its an equivalent being effectively a blockchain community in which it has a disintermediated medium in which it can come to agreements and collateralize those agreements and then be judged by a jury of their peers, right? Um, right now, putting the collateralization down is hard enough. Getting people to agree to those is hard enough. And there is almost no teeth in some of those agreements, depending on like how powerful you are as a body, right? And so, like, while I don't think that this system will, wholly solve that problem, I think that it is another tool that incrementally gets you better to this sort of ideal of equality between, um, you know, world actors, if not state actors.
Sure. I mean, so another way to, I guess, think about this, if you look at like what are the kind of really successful blockchain use cases so far, and in my mind, I can think of three. There's Bitcoin, which is basically digital gold. There are stable coins, which is like we can send money without kind of going through archaic banking systems. So that money will transfer a lot more freely. And then there's prediction markets, which I haven't followed exactly. They were banned in the US. I think the US has like slightly unbanned them or maybe fully unbanned them. But right, like some degree of regulatory friction. So like what do you see as, I guess, one of the next kind of use cases of blockchains, and where do you think like the first iteration of a blockchain community might come into existence?
When it comes to say governance, like we have to recognize that all of those applications have governance beneath them, right? Like to have like transactions between counterparties, you do need to have a notion of property rights, which is represented in these systems. And I think that if these systems are able to show that they are capable of securing that kind of value and even more value, then while there's no guarantee, I would like to think that capital will flow where it is respected. Now, when it comes to like say future applications, I think like a real boring one that is quite easily doable is just like registries, right? Like real property registries, like land parcel registries. I think these are a huge unlock. I remember speaking to a gentleman from Nairobi, Kenya, and he lived in the sort of outskirts of Kenya and had bought this property and gotten this deed, only to find out it took him a week to go to the real property registry in Nairobi and then back, only to find out that someone else had a same deed, right? Whether this is through corruption or just, poor record keeping, is kind of unclear, but this creates these enormous transaction costs in just spending 2 weeks traveling there and back, and then, obviously finding out that, this land was not done well. Assuming that they do have some kind of internet connectivity, which is, I know, a big assumption, but you can basically represent a lot of that on a auditable, impartial registry that is easily accessible to anybody on the internet. So I think that is hugely profound. And if you think about it, like the global real estate is worth 280 trillion, right? Fortune 500 companies have a combined value of 90 trillion. You can represent these things pretty easily on chain. Now, of course, there's a lot more external factors to this in their operations, but I think that can be hugely beneficial. Going back to the, say, United Nations medium and collateralization that I was talking about, you could have geopolitical boundaries represented in a registry as well for collateralization, which I think will become that could be a potential interest when it comes to territorial disputes, for example, and how they're represented.
So let's take, I've been hearing about, put land on the blockchain, put on a registry for a long time. I'm sure there are experiments I'm not aware of, but to me it seems I don't know, I think markets tend to be reasonably efficient. So if it is possible, I agree, it's a tremendous, really large market. So I guess why haven't blockchain land registries been more successful so far, or am I just not aware of some of the successes of them?
No, I think that's probably fair. Actually, one of my frustrations with crypto in general is it has failed to cross this sort of digital divide that I was talking about earlier, right? While it is true that people have bought, houses or yachts or, Lamborghinis with crypto, and even some countries have adopted, these sort of cryptocurrencies as legally sanctioned alternatives. There really hasn't been a huge usage of them, and I think partly some of the reason of that is in developed countries, a lot of our institutions are already stable or work well enough that there isn't a huge need to implement them. And then in, I say, developing countries where this could really benefit them, the infrastructure isn't quite there to be able to provide for them, right? Many of these places, you're choosing the difference between having some prepaid internet versus your next meal, right? And so getting that access to them is incredibly difficult. So, I mean, there's definitely a number of challenges to be made, but at the same time, let's say that you were 10 or even 15 years after the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia and going, ugh, nation states aren't a thing yet, right? It's a little, which is very early, right? And I think that there is a lot of potential there. Whether it comes to fruition, I think it still remains to be unseen, but I'm not going to be packing up just yet because I think there is so much potential.
Sure. I mean, to me, that's one of the, I guess, classic questions with blockchain is what is the right analogy for it? Because the pessimistic view is right. The Bitcoin white paper was 2008. And then now we're almost 20 years later and the use cases are right. And the other two, stable coins and prediction markets only really evolved as use cases in the last 5 years. So for the first 12 years or so, there were almost no use cases. And if you think about a similar technology that evolved, that kind of got started at the same time, like Uber or Airbnb, right? I Uber, I don't know, multiple times a week, right? It's a very kind of convenient addition to my life. And so that's kind of critical take. The optimistic take is, right, they're functioning at different layers of social change where you would naturally expect a successful company or technology to have a pretty immediate impact when if you're talking about kind of the changing the governance stack that has a much longer time horizon to implement the change because kind of by definition you want your governance stack to be relatively stable because that allows you to make investments and long-term decisions.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like I think I can sympathize with that, and I can see that as well. Like, I wouldn't argue against it in any strong or meaningful way. Having that said, like, there's still something there to me, right? Like, I think the idea that you can have a store of value, or you can even transmit, potentially millions of dollars for 30 cents to anyone anywhere on the planet, that someone could create a set of smart contracts that represents a new way of coordinating humans and do it in their underpants and deploy it within 30 seconds or less to anyone on the planet is huge. I think the ability to, like, for people in developing countries to be able to access global markets without really any middlemen, so to speak, is also huge. I feel like there's just a huge amount of potential there. Um, I guess, like, one of the other sort of like huge influencing um, themes is just like this idea of like piracy or peer-to-peer file sharing, right? And there's kind of like two ways of viewing this. Like, one is through the book The Pirate Organization, which basically argues that or views pirates and pirate utopias as operating on like the fringes of capitalism and being able to expand or allow the state to then formalize those new markets or economic activities, and in the process of that, and so like this idea is like you had these peer-to-peer file sharing programs that so people are probably familiar with, like Napster or LimeWire or maybe even BitTorrent, for example. Um, and they're very interesting, right? Because they were able to challenge copyright law and do so in a meaningful way to a lot of users. And they were not easy to stop, right? In fact, the way that they really got stopped was through a similar way that sea piracy, when it was more rampant is through the establishment of corsairs, right, or privateers, who are all basically operating as pirates or operating within these new economic activities, but state sanctioned or on behalf of the state. We see the same analogy here with the rise of like streaming services like Netflix or Spotify or so on. And why do I bring this up? This idea of peer-to-peer protocols and the capacity to be able to radically change markets and be disruptive in this way is kind of what is embedded in like this kind of technology that we're talking about, such as like any kind of blockchain, right? Like, they are peer-to-peer protocols, and they are able to circumvent some aspects of cyberspace. And to understand that, I think is probably also worth understanding, a project like Tor, for example. You've had like very large nation states, like China, Turkey, Russia. They've all effectively tried to ban public relay nodes, and every single time they were ineffective. In fact, the Tor user base grew every single time that happened. Tor was instrumental in the Arab Springs, right? And so, like, I think that while there is some level of stability today, and maybe there isn't a huge application today, I can totally foresee that a black swan event or some political situation happening within some kind of country in which they need stable institutions that they're not underserviced citizens within a particular jurisdiction is not receiving, can receive it. I mean, this is what happened in Latin America, and particularly in Argentina. There was a whole black market around Bitcoin. So it's not like it was just like magic internet money that wasn't doing anything. It had like real use cases. I would like to see an expansion of the use cases beyond finance, but like, there's also, I mean, it's a great place to start, right? Like, getting more and more capital into like these kinds of systems allows us to then build out our economy and build out more infrastructure in the real world, is what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I guess is the problem with Black Swan is, right. American government finances are obviously unsustainable, and at some time that stops being sustained, and maybe that's 5 years, maybe that's 25 years. And when that happens, I expect, yeah, Bitcoin, and I don't know if like maybe people at that point have created stable coins backed by a basket of goods or something that ends up becoming much more valuable. Uh, but I think, well, that's kind of because you're like, as I understand your kind of broad thesis, it's right, like blockchain communities are going to not like supplant the nation state, but complement the nation state, right? Taking over some functions that the nation state was previously doing, and the nation state will like still be there, still be in the background, but not be as kind of dominant of a force as it is today. And like one analogy, if you look at, for example, the kind of fall of the Roman Empire, it's not like the Roman Empire just like died and went away. All right, like what happened was, at least in the Western sphere, right, the kind of previous large estates ended up being basically like the principalities and dukedoms of the early medieval era. And I don't know if that's fully analogous, but like I guess what kind of question is, all right, if we're going to unbundle the nation state and like just to throw out several of the services the nation state provides, like which of these do you see being unbundled for blockchain communities? And so these services include like national defense, education, welfare, which tends to be aimed at poor and or elderly, like local safety, proper rates, courts, infrastructure. I'm sure there's some like I guess regulation, obviously like FDA regulating medicine, but like what areas do you see blockchain communities kind of taking over and playing a role in?
I think they can take a role in a lot of those, actually. Like you've mentioned before, you don't necessarily even need like a blockchain to make some of these happen, as long as you're operating within the authority of the jurisdiction that you've registered the company and your bank accounts in, right? But there's reasons why you'd want to do it on these systems. Create it in such a way. And what I mean by that is like, say, for example, like a welfare program. Right now in the current systems that we have, we are basically making a very strong trust assumption that the people in charge are not corrupt. They are not skimming any money off like giant pension funds or anything like this for themselves or, you know, their peers. Yet our capacity to really audit that doesn't exist. Right, like I can't go and inspect, you know, what the operations of these very large institutions or public institutions are able to do. I can't validate the rules in which they're operating. I assume that like they're operating, you know, in good faith, and that's probably a fair assumption. But you could create, you know, these sets of rules or procedures in such a way that they are auditable in a real sense, and you can have stronger guarantees. I don't like to use the word guarantee, right? But you can have stronger sort of assurances that the system is operating as intended or as written. And whether you choose, like you agree with those rules or not, is up to your voluntary choice within those systems. I think when it comes to, you know, say like arbitration services, like we've already seen this happen. Like Jarrad has been used for arbitration in Mexican courts. I can't remember exactly the case, but I know that that's already happened. I think anything that can be like represented as a market can also be easily represented in the within these systems. So like in a similar way that, you know, you benefit from something like Uber. I think there was an app called used to be called Vigilante. It might be called Citizen now, but it is effectively like a neighborhood watch. And there's similar versions of that application or that idea that have employed like off-duty policemen to help solve domestic issues, right? Through these sort of neighborhood watch programs. So I think there's a lot of potential in these kinds of systems. Again, coming back to like my idea of like what a DAO used to be versus what it is today. And that's, yeah, I'll probably stop myself there.
Definitely agree with you on the thesis. There's kind of a classic example of, I guess, off-duty police officers. This was in New Orleans, I think 2014, 2015, when an entrepreneur just hired a bunch of them. And I think it was only for the French Quarter. And basically, I think businesses had to pay a subscription or something, but they cut travel, like response times down from like 30 minutes to 3 minutes. So they just stuck them in a bunch of souped up golf carts, and you've got a GPS in the golf cart. So if the police doesn't show up, you can call them up and yell at them. And because there's kind of a private market, what happens with a lot of public sector services is the employees end up having a lot of bargaining power, and the employees tend to not want to do the work. So they're able to in terms of police, have slower response times, less crime investigation. But here, because there was a market incentive, and there's recently just an app that just launched on my Twitter called like Protector, offering the same thing. I mean, I guess part of the risk is like if countries do become more, let's call it antagonistic to some of these forms of social organization, where you mentioned Argentina, right? Because they had a terrible monetary policy for so long. It's not surprising that they had tried to adopt alternatives. Right now, at least the US is relatively free. And so even if you look at um, prediction markets, Poly market is being competed with for companies called T something, like Andrews and Horowitz back prediction market that is not on the blockchain, right? And so, um, right now, for example, yeah, you can do private security and incorporate that through all the normal channels. But if the state starts kind of cracking down on that, which is possible, doesn't feel probable, but it's not out of the realm of possibility, right? Then blockchain alternatives become a lot more attractive.
Yes, and there's still some issues with it, right? So like I guess so the U.S. military kind of formally recognized cyberspace next to as another domain of conflict next to land, sea, air, and space, right? Um, and I think they partition it into basically three dimensions. One is like the infrastructure side of things. One is like the logic or data flows, and then the other is like the netizens or users of them, right? Um, and so one of these systems kind of needs to be able to have answers or mitigations to be able to continue operating across all three of those domains. And that's certainly possible with these protocols that we've developed. They can be improved upon as they are currently deployed today, especially around the providing more anonymous communications and privacy around stake and proof of stake systems to protect validators and make sure that they're impartial to the content that's flowing through them. But the reason why I mentioned that is coming back to your point is like, so you can then use that as a platform for like pirating or deploying like governing institutions or corruption resistant institutions. But there's still like one major issue, right? And that's just like turning the internet off. And this happens, right? Now, like, I guess like when I was, really starting to get into this, I remember reading a report from Access Now, which is like this internet rights advocacy group. And they basically made the argument that the average length of an internet shutoff was approximately 6 days. And that it was incredibly costly for like even a dictator to be able to shut off the internet, especially if their economy is so intertwined with the internet. So I was initially operating under that assumption that like, well, even if you are covered for these, then like you're assuming that internet access is more or less stable, right? And it might go off every now and then, especially during like very intense political conflicts. But would ultimately not be sustainable for a society. However, since then, the major internet shutdowns are starting to reach like average lengths of like 22 days, right, or 3 weeks. They still hurt like both the local economy and the global economy when this does happen. But I guess it's considered to be worth it. It's also been done in a more precise fashion, right? I think there's roughly 30 internet shutdowns that have lasted more than a year right now. The vast majority only happened for like less than 72 hours. But still, if you could imagine a group of people who are maybe like displaced that are in a very particular set area and they do have internet connectivity. It's not unimaginable that the internet would only be cut off in that particular area, in which they would then need to, have their own energy, their own mesh networks, or other alternate infrastructure for maintaining communications. So we, at the end of the day, even though like we're talking about technology, like I'm an avid believer that it doesn't really matter what political system you have; it's really about the people. It's always about people.
Yeah, and like I mean, in addition to hard shutdowns, you also kind of have firewalls, right? Like China has reasonably successfully firewalled their internet from the rest of the world. Obviously, you can get a VPN. My understanding is China kind of turns a blind eye somewhat intentionally to the VPNs as a way to let off steam, but that obviously kind of is a substantial restriction on the ability to use the internet, where even if you are using a VPN, presumably if you start doing something the Chinese government doesn't like and they catch you, that's a ready-made excuse to throw you in jail for 5 years or harass you to disincentivize you to continue with that action.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of why I mentioned the Tor earlier as well, right? Is like, even though China did ban public relays, there is certainly, and like it is an effective means to be able to do, like, say, deep packet inspection or, internet shutoffs. And there's a variety of techniques that governments like China's could employ, or, any country. There are also, it's kind of a cat and mouse game, right? And you can circumvent a lot of these things. You can mask that traffic from deep packet inspection. And the nature of peer-to-peer protocols, depending on how they're constructed, can operate in such a way that you kind of have to plug almost every IP, right? Or at least the whole set of IPs and how they're communicating. And that becomes incredibly difficult. It's not insurmountable, but if there was a motivated community, they would probably still be able to access it regardless.
Cool. So we've been talking a lot about your book, Farewell to Westphalia, but you also are the founder of the Logos Network, and it's, I guess, I'm not fully familiar. I did a little bit of background on it, but you're trying to kind of instantiate some of the principles, some of the ideas in the book, in real life, right? So I guess, what does Logos Network do, and how is it related to this broad vision of the future?
Sure. So I mean, Logos is essentially a combination of what used to be called the Holy Trinity of protocols. They're all basically making different trade-offs on storage, on communication costs or bandwidth, and consistency, right? So what I mean by that is we have a blockchain or a multi-chain network, and we have a ephemeral communication protocol, and we have a decentralized file storage protocol. The difference between these is that they're all privacy preserving, and so the node operators themselves and the people accessing content over them are effectively blind or to the content that's being, or services rendered by the network. So the idea creating is that you create this sort of disinterested, impartial medium in which you can then establish an economy on top of. In our case, we want to also take it a little bit further and actually start crossing this digital divide and rendering real governing services and institutions to ideally informal economies, or to anyone that we can help do that. And there'll be also a stronger, on the social side of things, a push to do more direct community development in different areas.
Great. Is there any question that you would have liked me to ask that I did not ask?
No.
Well, great. Thanks for coming on the podcast. The book, Farewell to Westphalia, I don't know when it's coming out, so you'll have to tell the audience.
Hopefully very soon. We've had to do some back office administrative stuff, but that's now been solved. So hopefully within the month or so.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening to the Charter City podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. You can follow us on your favorite podcasting platform or subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this conversation, we'd appreciate you sharing it on social media. Thanks for listening, and we hope to see you again.